So let's take a look back. Our previous lesson about null and alternative hypothesis are used in statistical hypothesis testing. The null hypothesis of a test always predicts no effect or no relationship between variables, while the alternative hypothesis states your research prediction of an effect or relationship. So null hypothesis. A null hypothesis is a kind of statistical hypothesis that claims that there is no statistical significance in a particular set of observations. In quantitative analysis, the null hypothesis, often referred to as the conjecture, is used to test theories about markets, investing methods, or economies to determine whether they are true or untrue. This is the perspective that relationships in samples solely reflect sampling error and that relationships in population do not exist. Informally speaking, the null hypothesis is the sample association occurred by chance. Alternative hypothesis. Ito naman yung vice versa ng null hypothesis. The idea that there is a relationship in the population and that the relationship in the sample reflects this relationship in the population. Note, the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis are useful only if they state the expected relationship between the variables or if they are consistent with the existing body of knowledge. They should be expressed as simply and concisely as possible. They are useful if they have explanatory power. HO always has a symbol with an equal in it. HA never has a symbol with an equal in it. The choice of symbol depends on the wording of the hypothesis test.
Let's formulate the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis.
So guys, ngayon ating pag-uusapan ang tungkol sa null hypothesis. For the first question, there should always be an equal sign in the null hypothesis. Hypothesis testing starts with an assumption that the null hypothesis is true. Then data is gathered that may show that the null should be rejected. So guys, palagi natin tatandaan na ang null hypothesis ay dapat kinakailangan i-include ang equal sign alinsunod sa pagpapalagay na ito ay totoo. Ang equal sign din ay makakatulong upang may payag kung ano ang ipinapalagay na totoo. For the second question is, the null hypothesis usually correspond to the assumption that two change occurs. So, the null hypothesis states that there is no relationship between two population parameters, an independent variable and dependent variable. If the hypothesis shows a relationship between the two parameters, the outcome could be due to an experimental or sampling errors. And that's all.
In statistical hypothesis testing, the alternative hypothesis represents the claim or theory that we want to test against the null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is typically formulated using the symbols greater than to make directional prediction about the relationship between variables, and less than, specifically indicating that one variable will have a smaller value than another, or not equal to specify the direction or nature of the effect we are investigating. The choice of the alternative hypothesis depends on the purpose of the statistical test and the specific research questions being investigated. So, kapag ang alternatibong hypothesis ay kumakatawan sa alternatibo o ninanais na resulta ng mananaliksik, habang ang null hypothesis ay kumakatawan sa kawalan ng epekto o walang kaugnayan sa pagitan ng mga variable.
Now, let's formulate the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis of this problem. A researcher reports that the average salary of private school teachers is 10,000 pesos. A sample of 40 teachers has a mean salary of 10,870 pesos a month at 0.05 level of significance. Test the claim that the private school teacher's salary is not equal to 10,000 pesos a month. The standard deviation of the population is 1,500 pesos. As we read the problem, we can identify the parameter to be tested, and it is the average salary of private school teachers. The null hypothesis is the average salary of private school teachers is equal to 10,000 pesos. In symbol, mean is equal to 10,000. The alternative hypothesis is the average salary of private school teachers is not equal to 10,000 pesos. In symbol, mean is not equal to 10,000. This alternative hypothesis is considered bidirectional because if the null hypothesis is rejected, this would mean that the average salary of private school teachers is less than or greater than 10,000 pesos.
After formulating the hypothesis, we need to decide what appropriate test statistic are to be used. So, pagkatapos mabuo ang mga hypothesis, kailangan nating magpasya kung ano ang naangkop na statistic ng test ang gagamitin. We should base it on whether the population standard deviation is given to the number of samples. Dapat natin itong ibase sa ibinigay na standard deviation ng populasyon at sa bilang ng mga sample.
This is the guide questions for problem number 1. Question number 1. Is the population standard deviation is given? The answer is yes. Population standard deviation is already given. Kung makikita natin sa given problem, ang population standard deviation ay given na which is 1,500 pesos. Question number 2. How many samples do we have in this problem? The answer is the number of samples in the given problem is 40. Yung sinasabi namang samples ay given na din, which is 40. Kung titignan natin sa given problem, ang given sample ay 40. Tinutukoy ko dito ay yung 40 teachers. Question number 3. What statistical test must be used? The answer is z-test. Kaya naman z-test ang ginamit sa given problem dahil yung z-test ginagamit kapag yung population standard deviation ay given na. And yung number of samples is mas malaki sa 30 o katumbas lang nito.
Why z-test? Ang z-test ay statistical test na ginagamit para ma-determine kung ang dalawang population means ay magkaiba kapag ang variances ay kilala at ang sample size ay large. Yung z-test ay ginagamit kapag ang population standard deviation ay given at ang number ng sample ay greater than or equal to 30. Sa example, since 1,500 population standard deviation ay given at ang number ng samples ay 40 which is greater than 30. So then, ang z-test ay applicable. Ang formula ng z-test for mean ay z is equal to x minus population mean over population standard deviation over square root of sample size.
For example number 2, Mrs. Patata claimed that potato chips contain less than 150 milligrams salt per pack, but a random sample of 130 packs yielded an average salt content of 145 milligrams with standard deviation of 25 milligrams.
Use 0.01 level of significance to test the null hypothesis. Means is equal to 150 against the alternative means is less than 150. So here we use 0.01 level of significance to test the null hypothesis against the alternative. Null hypothesis. The potato chips contain 150 milligrams of salt per pack. In symbol, means is equal to 150. For alternative hypothesis, the potato chips contain less than 150 milligrams of salt per pack. In symbol, means is less than 150. The alternative hypothesis is considered directional because if the null hypothesis is rejected, it will only means that the potato chips is less than 150 and not greater than 150.
This is the guide question in problem number 2. Letter A. The population standard deviation is not given. As you can see in letter A, what given that we get there is there's no standard deviation. So we can conclude that there is no standard deviation in this word problem. Letter B. The number of samples is 130. As you can see, the total number of samples that are going to test which is given 130 packs. Letter C. Test statistics is z-test. We could still use z-test because the number samples is more than 30. 30 is considered as a large number.
When conducting a hypothesis test, it is common to use the z-test when the sample size is considered large, which is generally defined as a sample size greater than 30. Although the population standard deviation is not given, we can still use the z-test because the sample size is large enough. In this case, we will use the sample standard deviation, which is 25 milligrams, as a substitute for the unknown population standard deviation. It is important to note the different assumptions and calculations involved in using sample standard deviation compared to population standard deviation, but it is still a valid method for conducting a hypothesis test.
This is possible because of the central limit theorem, which states that the distribution of sample means approximates a normal distribution as the sample size gets larger, regardless of the population's distribution. This theorem assures us that no matter what the shape of the population distribution is, the said distribution of the mean is closely normal distributed whenever n is large. Therefore, population standard deviation over the square root of sample size n is approximately equal to sample standard deviation over the square root of sample size n. The z-test formula transforms now to z is equals to sample mean minus the population mean over the sample standard deviation over square root of sample size n, where x bar is equals to sample mean, mu is equals to population mean, small letter s is equals to sample standard deviation, and small letter n is equals to sample size.
This question, ang level of significance na ginamit ay 0.05. The null hypothesis, or HO, is the average net weight of the facts is equal to 250 grams and symbol of population mean is equal to 250 grams. Dahil nga ito ay null hypothesis, naglagay tayo ng equal sign na ang ibig sabihin ay there is no significance difference between the dependent and independent variables, or pareho lamang ito. The HI, or alternative hypothesis naman, ay the average net weight of the packs is greater than 250 grams and symbol of population mean greater than 250 grams. Dito naman sa alternative, gumamit tayo ng greater than sign dahil mas mataas ang average net weight o yung 8 randomly na selected facts kaysa sa advertised net weight na 250 grams. Dahil dyan, masasabi na may pagkakaiba ang independent at dependent variable nito.
This is the guide questions for problem number 3. Question number 1. Is the population standard deviation is given? The answer is, the population standard deviation is not known or given. Kung makikita natin sa problem, walang given na population standard deviation, kaya naging unknown siya. Question number 2. How many samples do we have in this problem? The answer is, the number of sample is 8. Yung sinasabi namang number of sample ay given na, which is ayun yung 8 randomly selected facts. Ayun yung mga number na 252, 251, 253, 249, 248, 251, 254, and 249. Question number 3. What statistical test must be used? The answer is, test statistic is t-test. Kaya naman t-test ang ginamit sa problem. Kasi kung may tatandaan nyo, ang t-test ginagamit kapag ang population standard deviation ay unknown. Or kung hindi naman, magbe-base tayo sa number of sample, which is dapat less than 30.
When we do statistical analysis, we need to choose the right method to get the most accurate results. In this example, we are trying to find if the weight of a certain brand of coffee is actually more than what it is written on the package. Since we don't know the standard deviation of the entire population of coffee packs, and we only have data for 8 coffee packs, we need to use a method called t-test. This is because when we have a small sample size which is less than 30, the t-test is more appropriate than other methods like the z-test, wherein t is equal to sample mean minus population mean divided by the sample standard deviation over the square root of the sample size. It is important to choose the right method for hypothesis testing because it affects the conclusions we make based on the data.